Welcome to the Sencast. My name is Dale Pickles. I'm the host of the Sencast and the managing director of B Squared. For those listening to this episode when it's released, Happy New Year! Let's hope 2025 is an amazing year, and let's give it at least 2 months before we say it isn't. We created the Sencast to try and help make schools more inclusive, to help teachers be teachers of SEND, and to help support staff be more aware. The Sencast is also a great way to get the same consistent message to schools and parents. Every week on the Sencast, we have a different guest or guests that I have invited on to talk about a specific area. And my guests this week are Clare Ward and Dr. Jamie Galpin. Clare has worked in the world of SEND for the last 30 years in a variety of roles, and Jamie is a chartered developmental psychologist with a long career in SEN as well. And today we're talking about sensory uncertainty. The Sencast is created and produced by us here at B Squared, and as well as this podcast, we also have our Sencast sessions, our online CPD. And if you haven't accessed a Sencast session, these are video CPD sessions, often with the same guests as we have on the podcast. We run 9 live sessions and 2 free SEND briefings every year. The sessions are £10 per school, and you can watch live on the day or watch later on. We have over 150 sessions you can use for CPD across the whole school. And for even better value, you can now subscribe for £175 a year and access all our CPD sessions. But before we do that, let's get on with the podcast. In this week's show, we're discussing sensory uncertainty, how to recognise and what to do next. My guests this week are Clare Ward and Dr. Jamie Galpin. Clare has worked in the world of SEN for the last 30 years in a variety of roles, including TA, speech and language therapist, social worker, and NHS manager. And Clare specialises in working with young people with social communication difficulties, some of whom have a diagnosis of autism. Jamie is a chartered developmental psychologist and also has a long career in SEN. He has a master's in child development and a PhD in developmental psychology. And Clare and Jamie met when they worked for the same multidisciplinary outreach service in inner London. And between Jamie and Clare, they are amazing at sharing what research looks like in practice. Welcome to the show, Jamie and Clare.
Hello.
Hello, thank you very much for having us. It's lovely to be back.
Excellent. So we both, all 3 of us, recorded a podcast on desperately seeking certainty, which does feel like a really long time ago. Back in probably not far off after COVID, I think it was, or during COVID, cannot remember. And it's still one of my favourite episodes I've ever recorded. It really helped me change how I interact with people, trying to give everyone more certainty. So when we're having that discussion, it's like, how can I bring that certainty in? And generally, I found it helps things go smoother. Now, sensory processing. Now, that's not a new concept, but how do you identify what a sensory processing difficulty looks like and the impact?
I suppose that first question there around kind of how you recognize it was a kind of real focus for some of our recent work, and particularly supporting individuals to recognize it in themselves, as opposed to necessarily supporting practitioners or adults around recognizing it in the child and young people they work with. I think because it can look very different for each individual, and depending on the context they find themselves in, that there's probably no sort of handy list of these are the signs that this individual is experiencing some difficulties or differences around their sensory processing. It's trying to, I suppose what we've been working on recently is trying to support children and young people to recognize in themselves when something's just feeling maybe not quite right or feeling a little bit kind of out of kilter. And, Claire will talk more about sort of how we frame that. We lean heavily on a metaphor that'll be probably very familiar already to a lot of your listeners around thinking about our senses like cups. For adults, the focus we have there is really just flagging it as a potential reason behind the difficulties someone's experiencing. Because it is often difficult to see, and there isn't a simple checklist, and this is what it looks like. It's more helping people to take a step back and realize actually there could be a sensory motivation for what we're seeing here, or there could be a sensory driver for the discomfort, distress, or difficulty that somebody's experiencing right now. So just putting it on people's radars and then trying to do that kind of deeper work with children, young people to help them better understand their senses and how they're feeling and try to reduce any experiences of sensory uncertainty they might have in terms of not quite knowing what I'm feeling and why.
So in the book, we do have, it's just to talk about it for a second, it's mostly pictures to make it as accessible as possible. And within that, we give examples of things that people might be experiencing that might indicate, especially in a situation where you don't have much agency, you don't have much control over what you're able to do, i.e. a classroom where you're expected to sit with perhaps both feet on the floor and not make any noise of your own for a while. But for each sense, we give people some examples of things that they might do that might indicate that they're either trying to empty or fill up their cups. So in the metaphor, each sense has a different cup, each of the 8 senses, because we're including what one of my students insists on referring to the 3 that you've made up, Miss, which is as well as the...
I
So
like
you can
that.
talk about those ones you made up. And I was like, yeah, we are actually. So the first 5 are the 5 we know. And then the last 3 are the vestibular sense, the balance, proprioceptive, your body awareness, and then interoception, which is this ability to recognize and process internal feelings as emotions. They're called feelings because we feel them. So we do give examples of things we might do and perhaps explain them, because really greater understanding means, as Jamie said, people understand themselves better. But we also say to children who have this book and do work through it, show this to other people, help them understand why you're doing these things, why you're doing things that to teachers particularly look like unexpected behaviours, and they might even get labelled as inappropriate or worse. So all the naughty and difficult and all of that. I mean, if we can help someone understand why they do it, that was a major driver for the book.
So you mentioned your book. What is the book? We haven't mentioned the name of it.
Well, the book is called My Senses Are Like Cups, with the subtitle, What to Do When Everything Feels Too Much or Not Nearly Enough. And the central premise is that for each of our senses, we have a cup. And when that cup is almost completely full, we tend to feel calm, alert, able to do things, able to get on and do the things we want to do. But if that cup has too much information of it, it will overflow. And overflowing cups, interestingly, are probably easier to spot, don't feel great. And we do everything we can to empty it. So an example, a very simple example, is if there's too much noise, we might try and reduce the amount of noise we're experiencing, either by putting our hands over our ears or doing a runner. And then the opposite is true. So if there isn't enough information in somebody's cup, that can make them feel not quite right. So, or sticking with the sound cup, somebody working in a very quiet room might feel not quite right. And I think that happens certainly in secondary. I noticed that because there's loads of kids who are used to working at least with music on, or quite often with a video. They'll often have a movie on at home when they're working, and you put them in a very quiet environment in school, and they're like, feels not quite right. So they may start to do things to try and fill up their cup, which people around them might find annoying.
I'm someone who very much likes a bit of background noise. So when you're first in the office in the morning, generally the first person kind of turns the radio on and we listen to the radio. But when you kind of come in and almost like you don't think about it because someone else has already done it, then I'll be working for a while. Then my head's just going, something's not right. And I'm just not feeling right. And then finally I'll notice, turn the radio on, life is good. It's because if the radio's not there, I'm seeking noises. I'm looking for noises.
Yes.
Whereas
So
that certain level of music, I can just ignore everything else.
My favourite example of this is for any drivers out there, but sometimes do journeys that I know really, really well. And I'm so bored by them. I don't have enough. I'm not seeking, there isn't enough information going in because I can pretty much predict how that journey is going to go. And so there isn't enough going into sound cup, visual cup, whatever. So I'll turn the radio on. Oh, I won't be able to do that journey. It feels off. So I'll put the radio on exactly as you've just described. However, if I'm going somewhere new, I have to turn it off. And I notice that in myself quite often. It's just a nice way, I think, of understanding it for
But
adults.
I think, I remember the podcast, you said it here already, is they're called feelings because you feel them. And it was like, well, that's really obvious. But I think I've forgotten that. I've forgotten that you feel them in parts of your body. And I do wonder if I do have really good at my internal senses, the three made up ones. I might not be great at them. And it's things like, and I know that someone says it's kind of the more you use them, the better you get at understanding them and you learn how they mean. And I think it's taken me to be almost a proper adult. I'm going to say a proper adult for me to understand the whole quiet music at different times. It's not something I've learnt as a young child. It's taken things. There's probably lots of things I'm still learning, but I'm having to focus on it to learn it.
And I think the important thing there is that you've got the opportunity to be able to do that. And I think it's around an education context, creating space and opportunity for children, young people to do that. So this idea of just promoting curiosity amongst kids around their emotions and how they might be, so senses and how they might be feeling, to then be able to kind of help around understanding kind of emotions. And all our senses are kind of equally important, but we do tend to talk quite a lot about that internal sensory pathway, that interoceptive sense, because it's really kind of fundamental to emotion regulation, because it's how we reach emotion recognition. And you can't regulate something you don't recognize and understand. And that recognition and understanding, the cue is physiological. It's our bodies, our heart rate increases, my breathing gets slower. We then kind of piece that together to recognize, as long as we kind of understand those signals, we have certainty over them, it's not too much of a problem. The problem arises when I don't understand these sensations and I don't know what they're doing. And, from a very kind of foundational perspective, that is inherently perceived as a kind of threat because it's uncertainty. It's a kind of threat to my brain's ability to do that really the only thing it's setting out each day to do, which is keep me alive. We might have all sorts of other demands we would like our brain to take care of, but it may humor us and say, sure, that's very important, but I'm kind of going to focus on keeping you alive. And if we're alive at the end of the day, we can maybe reflect on some of that other bonus stuff you wanted to do as well.
I'm guessing, like, if we think of secondary school children who are all little angels and do everything they're told exactly when they're told and everything else, because they're all angelic little things, and actually they're all struggling with their emotions, and we see this persistent disruptive behavior. We see lashing out. We see bullying. We see people being just saying things they don't mean and then apologizing, and friendships breaking up and making up again, and then breaking up again, then best friends, then something else. And all of that is kind of them, all their cups are either overflowing or empty, but not recognizing it and not recognizing that is having an impact on them and why they are doing these things. We see the behaviors, but the cause behind them is, I'm guessing a lot of the time, it is those emotions as they're learning them all.
Well, it's all three S's. If you remember, we're looking at for uncertainty in three different places. One of them is in terms of structure, so the order of things in terms of time and space. Is that predictable? Is that sensory we've talked about? And absolutely for teenagers, you've got hormonal changes as well as the structural changes of moving to secondary and everything being a little bit more determined by you, but still ultimately controlled by teachers. And the social thing is just enormous. That's our third S. So structure, sensory, social, and social is immense. So they come in year 7 and suddenly the play dates arranged by parents. That doesn't happen anymore. And somebody who may have felt they were part of a friendship group suddenly discovers that actually that's not really the case once you're out in the big wide world. And a lot of young people, well, you either externalize or you internalize the difficulties. And you've just described some of the externalizing. So the trying to control friendships, the falling out, the lashing out, all of that. And then you get the internalizing, where you get young people who just withdraw. They're like, that sensory uncertainty is too big for me. I don't really understand it. I definitely don't like it. So I'm going to live my life doing the things that move me away from all of that. And of course, the trouble is that as you move away from all that uncertainty, you also move away from all the things that they really want and value in their life, because that uncertainty only shows up when there's something important to us.
And sort of, as much as we talk about the three S's as being kind of discrete, they are all interrelated, and particularly, in adolescence, that sensory and social, there's a big overlap. So sensory, particularly that internal sensory pathway, I use those signals that I'm getting from my body to build up an understanding of my body. And then I use my understanding of my body as a model for understanding other bodies. So if my understanding of my own body isn't quite as good as it could be, or a little bit kind of fragile, then that's also going to influence my ability to understand other bodies as well. So in adolescence, we see that kind of, co-occurrence. We have that kind of new change, or that just newness in terms of sensory signals, particularly those hormonal signals. And then we see an associated difficulty around kind of friendships and social relationships. So those two kind of interlinking with one another. And you compound that with the fact that also at that age, there is increased importance. Social relationships have become higher stakes. We're moving from our family being the center of our social universe to friends becoming the center of our social universe. And we've got a kind of natural kind of drive to want to be part of that group, potentially just because we survive better as part of a group than on our own. So there's maybe that kind of drive for that kind of, for that belonging, for that sense of belonging. So we would expect, all teenagers to be struggling a little bit around that sensory element. And again, it influences on emotions, and because those sensations seem to be more volatile. And it also plays a big role around kind of structure, because, and again, this internal sensory pathway, the interoceptive sense, external sensory information is always going to be more volatile, more unpredictable. I don't know when there's going to be a loud bang or a big flash or those sorts of things. I can usually rely on the signals I'm getting from my body, because they're relatively stable. And I also have a pretty huge data set to draw from to kind of build quite a good model for understanding my body. Because even in utero, in the womb, I'm picking up these signals about my body and starting to kind of understand that. And that then central kind of stable foundation of my body is almost like my port in the storm of external sensory information. So I've got all this kind of volatile stuff outside, but I can usually I've got that kind of grounded sense of understanding myself in this space. But if I don't have that, or it's not quite as good as it could be, then suddenly everything's sort of off or out of balance. And that's where you might get, difficulties delineating between external senses and internal senses. So I've got a headache, it's recognizing that's internally driven rather than something outside of me making me feel like that, which in turn impacts where I'm going to look for a solution to try to fix this difficulty that I might be experiencing.
Now, interesting, you mentioned headaches, and obviously one of the made-up senses is interoception, which would be one part of your interoception. And you could say, I think some people say that each one of these are a separate sense, so like the sense of thirst and things like that. But I used to, for years, had migraines, and I get them a lot. And people say, oh, it's if you eat cheese on a Friday because you're tired, and things, all these kind of different reasons. And for me, I've really found the most common reason for me is dehydration. So I have to make sure I drink at least 2 liters of fluids a day. And even yesterday, I was going to bed, I'm going, I don't think I've drunk enough. I think I have. I don't think I have. Have I? Haven't I? Woke up this morning about 4 or 5 a.m. with a headache. I was like, I obviously didn't. So get up. So for me, I don't have the sense of thirst. Yeah, I find that really odd, because that's the thing giving me my headaches. If I had a sense of thirst, I wouldn't have my headaches. But I obviously don't have, or I'm not paying attention to, or it's gone, because apparently you lose it as you get older and things like that. But It's like, come on, body. You
Yeah.
know what you need. Why are you not telling yourself, go have a But that's a whole probably confusing conversation.
Well, no, it's all part of it. And obviously, I work with young people who struggle with food. So I've got a young woman I'm working with now. She's in her last year of school. She never gets hungry. She doesn't experience the sensation of hunger. Added to which, she has a small sort of touch cup, if you like. So the texture of food and taste and smell, all those cups are very small because all of us have cups that are different sizes at different times. And in general, her sort of taste, touch, and smell cups are pretty small, so they're easily overwhelmed. Added to which, her hunger cup is hard for her to tell how full it is. So
She
she
can't
has a
find it.
really hard time. She can't find it. She lost it. But she has a really hard time maintaining her weight as a result. So they all interrelate. And I agree. You think, come on, body. It's a really nice way of putting it. It's like, what are you doing to her? What, how does this come about? I think her story's complicated. And I think there's some research out there that says that some of these reduction in interoceptive signals are because the signals or the behaviors that internal signals made some kids do when they were younger were shut down. So if their behavior was, say, they were being driven to move a lot as a young child, and slowly that was kind of squashed out of them because they were expected to sit for longer, sit at the dining table, kitchen table, to, eat their dinner and not get down and run around in between. I'm going to take movement as the example, but it could be anything. And slowly they stop listening to their internal signals saying, you need to move, you need to run, or you need to eat, or you don't need to eat, or whatever, because the environment around them decided that these were not always appropriate behaviors for the situation. So there's research out there that link that sort of lack of agency again with sort of people starting to listen less to their internal signals. As a result, they become less available to them. I've probably said that really badly, and Jamie will say it brilliantly, but I think there is this feeling that it is kind of, the combination again of those internal signals moving someone in one direction and the environment saying, no, no, shut those signals down, that leads to real difficulties later on.
And I think maybe I'll just sort of maybe backfill some of our cup bits just in case anybody is not familiar with the kind of cups metaphor. So it's been around for a while. We certainly did not come up with it, but we sort of just utilize it in the book that Claire's kind of referring to there. That essentially we can kind of think of all of our sensory systems as being a bit like cups, and sensory information or sensory data is the liquid going into the cup, and those cups can be different sizes. And maybe if we're kind of less responsive in a certain sense, it's like we've got a really big cup. I need loads and loads of input for that cup to be full. And as Claire said at the start, we want those cups to be full but not overflowing. That's that kind of sensory certainty. And if I'm kind of oversensitive or kind of hypersensitive, it's like I've got a small cup. So just a little bit of input and that cup is overflowing. And so what we want is those cups to be full. And I suppose without undermining the point I made at the beginning that you can't spot sensory difficulties, if your cup is not full enough, you might naturally look to try to start to fill it up. And that's what we call kind of sensory seeking behavior. So, if say on this recording, if we had to sit down and weren't allowed to move for a very long time, we would see all of our kind of movement senses, two of those made up ones, so the vestibular and proprioceptive, that cup's sort of emptying out. And what we would see is we would, at the very least, start fidgeting and wiggling around on our chairs, twiddling with things. And, so I'm trying to fill my cup up. I'm trying to regulate myself. But at the same time, if we've got too much input, we'll see sensory avoidant behavior. So I'm just trying to kind of reduce the amount of input that's coming into my cup. So in that sort of prototypical example of covering over my ears because, there's too much sound that I'm processing at any given moment. And so broadly speaking, and I think it's particularly relevant for younger children, but can work with older children. There's the phrase often kind of see physical, think sensory. If you see a kind of physical behavior or physical kind of action, you can think, could there be a potential sensory motivation for this? A really kind of clear example would be sort of repetitive motor behaviors, that sometimes referred to as kind of stimming or self-stimulatory behaviors. That's a really good example of see physical, think sensory, because they might not necessarily be motivated by a cup being too full or too empty. They could be, but what they do is they give me sensory certainty. And that sensory certainty can then potentially offset uncertainty that I might be experiencing elsewhere. So whether it's social uncertainty, whether it's structural uncertainty, or whether it is sensory uncertainty. So let's say I'm having a really great time doing an activity and I'm really excited and having loads of fun. That actually might be causing me some uncertainty, because even though it's a positive experience, I'm getting some quite intense sensations from my body now. And if I can't understand what these are, then essentially what I'm going to be feeling is some uncertainty. So I might look to kind of bring some control back to this situation by manipulating the intensity or amount of sensory input I receive. And I might do that through self-stimulatory behaviors, because they put me in control. So I know, the harder I kind of, for me, I chew gum. So I know the more I chew gum, the more intense the sensation I'm going to feel. The less I chew gum, the less intense I'm going to feel. It puts me in control of this situation, and that can offset uncertainty I might be feeling elsewhere. And self-injurious behavior is obviously a kind of extreme end of that. Again, I know the harder I bite my hand, the more intense this sensation, and that can therefore bring certainty. If I'm experiencing interoceptive sensory information that I don't understand, I can kind of override that with this intense sensation of me biting my hand. If it's social uncertainty, I know if I do this, then other people will behave in this way and in this way and this way. Or I know if I do this, then this will happen, and this will happen. So giving that kind of structural kind of certainty. And those sort of repetitive motor behaviors, are kind of, again, back to the point of how you can spot if somebody's having some difficulties. If we see those kind of stimming behaviors, essentially it's telling us that that person is currently managing some uncertainty. And you would never stop somebody doing that. But the point of interest from a kind of practitioner perspective is that's a signal that that child is managing something. And it might well be that the strategy they've got, whether it's chewing gum, pacing, flapping hands, whatever it might be, that's fine. That's how I manage it, and it's okay. But it might be that they'll reach a point where this strategy I've got, whether it's my chewing gum or whatever it might be, the uncertainty gets too big for this to offset it. That's when you'll see those crisis level kind of behaviors, that real exaggerated need for control, start to come out. So it's recognizing, okay, this individual's got a great strategy here for managing. It's an independent strategy, it's chewing gum or whatever it is, as long as nobody stops me doing it. So we would never stop somebody, but we would go, but it's indicative of the fact that they're under some stress right now. And it might be manageable, but it might be that actually it could soon get too much. And so we need to look to kind of manage that or kind of support them through that.
It was interesting. You talked about like overriding that senses, and I'd never thought of it like that. That kind of this is going on, but if I do this, then it kind of fills my cup with this, and my cup is full. Where a moment it's empty, and whatever's going on is not filling me up. So if I do this, it's almost like I can just turn that tap on more. It's a different tap because it's the tap I'm controlling, and I can turn it on, and I can stop and start it as I need to keep me at that level.
Yeah. It's like if you've got a noise that you dislike, then you can turn the volume up on your kind of favorite song, and it's all that kind of passive aggressive fights with your neighbor. If they're playing something music, you can turn up the volume on that because you're then in control of that. And so yeah, that signal's still there, and you're just sort of overriding it. And sometimes that's great, and there are going to be times when you're feeling more stressed, and actually that can be kind of calming. But there might be other times when actually it's not going to be sustainable. So Yeah.
Because I think most of the time when you're overriding, in my head, you're kind of filling that cup which isn't full. When it's already overflowing, you don't want to add any more sensory stuff. But in reality, you're probably in that zone where I don't like that sensory stuff. It's overflowing. So you're trying to drown it out, but it's probably really hard. And the whole time you're trying to drown out, but you're already overloaded, you're losing no matter what, aren't you?
Yeah, unless of course that you can sort of replace, like I am replacing what someone else has put in my cup with something that I'm choosing to put in there. And I think, that's why those kind of strategies can work. I think, helping people understand this idea of predictability and being in charge of your own sensory experience has just been really transformative, actually, because I think out there, practitioners do find some of those behaviors really, and parents actually, I think they find those sort of self-regulatory behaviors quite challenging. And I think it is, I mean, hopefully that's what this book is about, but it is that idea of if somebody can do something that they can predict will make them feel a certain way, then then it's manageable. We should be really helping them find what those things are.
I think, Jamie, you talked about your chewing gum, and I think my wife does the same. We get through a lot of extra chewing gum. But I think we don't recognize there are things we do as adults are self-regulating. We do them all the time. We might have our routines. I always get up at this time. I always go for a run. Or I always do this. I always pop here at this time, or I always get a Costa. We have all these kind of things to help us regulate and do. It might be I see my friends down the pub, or I go for a walk, or we do all of these, but we don't label them as self-regulating. If we took all the activities throughout our week and worked out, is this a self-regulating activity, or is this something there'd probably be quite a lot of self-regulating activities. We just don't label them.
Movements, and the typical one is kind of rocking yourself back and forward, that kind of very kind of, but there is probably, and for some people it might be kind of painting, for some people, as you say, it might be jogging, but often the thing that kind of unites it is that kind of rhythmical kind of back and forth movement. And potentially, the reason for that is we associate that rhythm with being regulated, because kind of harking back to our last podcast with you, we're going around, we're constructing these kind of models of the world based on statistical regularities in sensory input we receive. So my brain can never access the world around me. All my brain's got access to is the sensory data I receive. So how does my brain build an understanding of the world? Well, through statistical regularities, through the co-occurrence of different kind of bits of sensory information, and the kind of frequency with which that happens. So, every time it snows, it's cold. These two things kind of co-occurring. I tend to then associate them with the snow with the cold. And then it means when it's snowing, I can look outside and go, okay, it's cold. I can put an extra jumper on, which allows me to then regulate myself, keep me energy efficient, which is, again, brain trying to keep me alive. It does that by regulating my energy. And right at the moment when we're in the womb, we're receiving that sensory data as well. And we're getting kind of these signals that, I'm not hungry because I'm just getting nonstop calories. I'm not thirsty because I'm floating around in liquid. I'm not like too hot. I'm not too cold. So all of our kind of physiological systems are kind of saying to us, I'm regulated. And at the same time, what we're getting through our auditory sense, or even kind of tactile sense and feeling the vibration, is this kind of frutum, 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 the sound of the kind of mother's heart rate reverberating on the diaphragm, that's giving us that kind of rhythm and that kind of low and slow kind of rhythmical sensation. And so we then associate these two signals together with that kind of linear, kind of repetitive kind of rhythm with being regulated. And it's why you'll see these things that don't actually align with each other coming into action. So, there's a really nice example. You've got the little boy like playing with his kind of on his game, and he really needs the toilet. And so he's getting signals from the bladder saying, I'm full, I'm dysregulated, I'm not where I need to be. And you'll see him, he'll start rocking back and forward. And that back and forward rocking has nothing to do with managing my bladder. The function of that is to try to tell me it's okay, you're regulated, and therefore trying to kind of ignore and offset that other signal that's saying actually you're dysregulated right
As you were talking then, me and Claire were both nodding, and I think in perfect alignment. And something tells me if you worked out the NPM, which is the nods per minute, I wonder if that would align with the heartbeat.
Yes, yeah, it might well do, but it's yeah, it and that's a really nice thing to know because it means that you know, and again, it doesn't work for some people. It doesn't actually work for some people. There isn't necessarily that association, and that's a real kind of point of interest. But for the majority of folks, it is. Those linear movements are kind of calming, and then conversely, kind of rotary movements or kind of spinning round and round, those sorts of things that they're alerting. Because actually, what you're doing is you're creating some sensory uncertainty. And that sensory uncertainty, fundamentally, uncertainty is a threat. It's a threat to my ability to stay alive. How does my brain try to navigate out of that? Well, it tries to knowledge its way out. It's like, okay, let's look for more data to try to understand what's going on here because I don't know what's happening. And knowledge my brain gets is through my senses. So it turns the volume up on my senses. And I know, you know, you've had folks, talk more eloquently than us around that kind of hypervigilance that can happen around sensory. So again, I recommend listening to any of Joe's episodes on the Zencast here, Joanna Grace. But you have that potential uh, compounding impact there for some people. If I'm feeling like I don't quite understand these sensations that I'm experiencing, then I'm going to try to knowledge my way out of this by seeking more data. But then that can quickly kind of spiral downwards because I already didn't necessarily understand the signals I was receiving. And those signals that are confusing are now amplified, and I'm getting even more of them. And so now I'm even more confused. And that may well then just lead to shutting down or just trying to kind of, huge exaggerated need to control behaviors in the face of that. And back to the kind of emotion regulation, for some kids, any state of arousal. So when I move out of my kind of resting state, whatever that might be for me, which is where our brain wants us to be, hopefully where the three of us are and where our listeners are, which is a nice kind of calm. Your heart rate's low and slow. It's your most sustainable. Your brain's very happy with you being there. But if I'm sort of, yeah, if I don't quite understand, what I'm experiencing and why, then those senses are going to become amplified and become overwhelming, and it's going to be really, really difficult for me to then kind of come back to that calm space. So at any time my heart rate increases or my palms get to, any sort of emotional cue can then become associated with something negative because it causes me to not know what's going on, and therefore I really, really just find any sort of emotional experience overwhelming.
I'm just still thinking of running at the moment in my head. I'm literally, my head's going, what is running? When all these people, my wife goes out for runs. She's healthy. But is the purpose of running exercise for the body? Or actually is for a lot of people, is it about that regulation that you are maybe overfilling, but you're kind of controlling what you're putting in it? It's that lack of communication, that sensory time to process. You're very much in control of all those things. Yes, you're running, you're doing the exercise, which is good for you, but actually you're just controlling all that sensory input. You might have your music on, you're in charge of the music, that auditory input, you're in charge of everything. And whatever you kind of dealing with or processing before is where you are at the moment, that's taking control, that's taking charge, that's what you've got to focus on. That's the kind of sensory input you're dealing with, which is usually you're controlling it, which you're much happier with.
Absolutely. I'm not a runner, so I can't really say I hate running. But I think it can be everything. Okay, I'm going to give you another analogy, just for anyone listening who isn't a runner. I'm a knitter. And for me, knitting at the end of the day is super regulating and also a bit like running. So at the end of a run, you've got all the knowledge that you have done something that's really good for you, I'd imagine, and that you feel like you're going to live longer. And, the product at the end of it, which is partly regulation, but it's also kind of knowledge that you've done something good and healthy for your body. And for me, knitting is very, very regulating. It is linear. I'm going across lines and backwards and forwards and creating regular patterns. I think also there's a visual regularity that lots of us find really appealing. I'm looking at the stripes behind you, Dale, and checks on a shirt, and regular pattern is something that is very sort of regulating for a lot of people. Anyway, but at the end of my knitting, I also have a product. I have something that I can then give to somebody else. I give it all away and I can do that. And I think absolutely it can be both. It can be something that we know is good or is a product or something and gives us because everything's huge regulation opportunities because, like you say, we choose. We choose how fast we run. We choose what direction we go in. We choose what music we listen to. Makes sense, doesn't it?
And it's interesting. As you said, you knit did you say you knit at the end of the day?
Yeah.
So it's kind of, you had your day. Now let's regulate. And it is that time you choose as well is part of it. And it isn't like, you know what, it's mid-afternoon, it's summer, it's great, let's knit.
Yeah, that doesn't happen for some reason. The other time of day, of course, the beginning of the day is when I used to do autism-specific training. I used to get everyone to write a list of the order of their day from the minute they wake up to the minute they arrive at their desk or classroom or whatever it was. And they'd all write their list. And then I'd say, okay, underline anything that has to happen in that order that couldn't move from the order. And then put an asterisk next to anything that if you didn't do that thing, you wouldn't be able to run your day. And it was really interesting. Some people had hardly any, some people had a lot. And it wasn't so much looking at people's need for structure and order, but the question was always, why do we do it then? Why is got people talk about their evenings not nearly as structured? And it's because of the uncertainty of the morning. You are doing a massive transition from being asleep to being at work through other loads and loads and loads of other transitions, mini transitions, if you like. Your senses, of course, are going through huge transitions as you get in and out of showers and, shove things in your mouth as you clean your teeth, and there's food and drink, and in a system that may not be fully regulating because we've only just woken up. But yes, we are doing it all the time.
And it's almost like sort of one thing's taken care of so you can focus on something else. It's like, okay, I've got sort of sensory covered. I've got my kind of cups where they need to be. So it allows then some cognitive capacity to be diverted instead towards something else. So now I can kind of look at this and focus on this. And that's important from a school context, because if we are not creating situations whereby children can ensure that their cups are full but not overflowing, then my full attentional capacity is not going to be available to access this lesson, because some of my attentional capacity is going to be focused on the fact that my cup's too full or too empty, that sensory seeking behavior and sensory avoidant behavior. Again, to that point that, we sit here talking for hours and never move, gradually the capacity to kind of, listen and coherently interact with one another is going to be reduced massively, because we're starting to focus our attention on something else elsewhere. So from a kind of school perspective, it's recognizing that for some children, if I'm busy trying to kind of process and manage this sensory input without being given a proper opportunity to really kind of manage it, I'm going to have less ability to listen to you in the lesson. So it's not a kind of zero sum game. It's not, okay, if I do 5 minutes of a sensory break for my class, then I get 5 minutes less of a lesson. It's actually, if I do 5 minutes of this sensory work with my class, then I get 15 minutes of high quality attentional focus and engagement, rather than 20 minutes of potentially poor focus and poor engagement. And it's why we, strongly recommend including sensory breaks in lessons, for all students, and, gradually moving to a point where we've worked with children in our classroom to come up with rules around when we take sensory breaks and why, so that children can take a sensory break when they need it. Because we can't really schedule it. You don't know, because we've all got different cups, and those different cups will be the sizes of those cups will be different depending on whether I'm tired, whether I'm feeling ill, well, what I've been doing this morning. So we can never plan for when a child's cup's going to be full or empty. So we need to give them the opportunity to start to recognize, okay, actually, I need to get up and have a walk around now, or I need to do this sort of thing, and that's going to kind of help me out. A bit like we might do if we're sitting doing a piece of work, we get a bit stuck, and we say, right, I'm going to go out for a walk, or I'm just going to go and move around a bit, and that's going to help me out. And it's looking to sort of, give children the agency. So first of all, the knowledge to understand, when I might be feeling like I need to do that. So when my cup's too full or empty or not full enough, and therefore things that I can do to kind of empty that cup up or fill it up. And it just means you're going to have much higher quality engagement in the lesson as a result of that being taken care of. And as well, thinking about, as much as I say you can't structure it, there are certain times where you definitely can recognize there's a need for some sensory activities, and that's particularly after those break times and lunch times, those kind of big kind of sensory onslaughts. You're going to need some sort of decompression transition activity between playtime and lesson time, even if it's just for a few minutes. It can't be run around, go crazy, come back with your cups all bubbling over or doing whatever they might be, or some kids that didn't have an active break time and their cups aren't full enough, and now come in here and have full attention straight away, listen to me. It's not going to happen. And so what you might then have is a child who's struggling to focus on you because of those sensory differences. I'm now not picking up what you're telling me. I'm not quite picking up what I need to be doing in this lesson. So now I have structural uncertainty around what I'm meant to be doing. So what am I going to look for? Control. And that's when you have those low level disruptive behaviors, because I don't know what I'm meant to be doing right now. So I'm going to do this because it puts me in control. So I know if I do this, I'll get told off or get asked to leave. Or this will happen, or this will happen, or this will happen. And so again, it goes back to tracking back when you're seeing that and saying, actually, could this be a sensory motivation for why this child's displaying this low level kind of behavior? And you might say yes, because they didn't understand what I was saying. Well, why didn't they understand what I was saying? Because they couldn't focus on me, because they were busy trying to process the fact that their cup was empty. And so they would, trying to fidget, trying to move around, trying to fill it up. So let's let them do that.
And I'm kind of, it's helping me regulate. Yes, you don't do it at the front of the class where everyone's looking. You're not doing it for attention. You're doing it that way. And it's the same if someone needs to move it. They can move their legs. They can fidget with things. It's like, but to me, it's with the fidgets, it's a personal thing. It's not you're showing off, oh, I've got this, or it's almost like hands under the desk and fidgeting and things like that, not distracting. And I think if you can kind of build that relationship with your students that you allow them to do it, and they do it in a way that isn't distracting for others, then life's great. They can regulate. There's nothing stops me walking at the back of the classroom and still putting my hand up and still answering the question. I can still do that because I'm more regulated.
Yeah. And I think there are increasing numbers of teachers and schools and educational environments that get that. I do think there are more than there used to be. I also think there's an awful lot of teachers struggling with their own uncertainty. And for them, a good lesson looks like a load of children sitting down and being quiet and following instructions, and anything that disrupts that model can be really challenging. And I think, teachers have got their own cups and they're quite often overflowing. And I completely understand it. And I think often, things need to be brought in a really systematic and long-term way. And I think there are teachers out there who've probably tried movement breaks, fidget tools, or focus tools. And initially, it does disrupt further, of course, because everybody's used to sort of things being a certain way. But I think with, perseverance and a really clear path across the school, things can be really different. I'm sure Jamie will talk more about it.
Yeah, no, just yeah, completely. I think again, when we think about that uncertainty and navigating it, you're absolutely right. It's the same for teachers, and why I said, it's important that we work as a class to come up with the rules and why we take what we do when we need a movement break and what it looks like, because if we've got people standing up and walking around, so say there's another student in the class and they might sometimes stand up, walk around, sometimes they don't stand up, walk around, sometimes they do this. For me, as another student in that class, I'm going to look at that person who's getting up, moving around, and I'm going to see uncertainty. And that's going to be anxiety provoking for me. So it's important that as a whole class, we sit together and come up with, okay, this is when we move and why we move. So then I'm sitting here doing my work, and I know if somebody over there stands up and starts walking around, I know why they're doing it. So it offsets some of that uncertainty that I'm feeling about why that's happening and why that person is moving around. And also for me as a teacher, I've got certainty, I've got the knowledge of why children might be doing these things at different moments, because you know it's a new thing. If you don't usually have these kind of movement breaks, and then we're asking teachers to do something new. So we're asking teachers to embrace some uncertainty. So we need to kind of offset that with knowledge or agency. So, again, that's what we try to do, is bring the knowledge of, okay, this is why we're doing it. This is why this is happening. This is why we're putting it in place. And this is, we know it's beneficial, as a general rule. And that applies to all those kind of movement break activities, and as you say, to those kind of fidgets or focus tools, which we kind of referred to them, which we completely stole from a really amazing school, and they've just rebranded all their fidget tools as focus tools, which I thought was a great way of kind of reframing them and re-looking at them to realize actually that helps that person focus, and it allows them to then having those good kind of class rules in terms of reference. And that has a broader impact of increasing a sense of belonging in this classroom. I've got a sense of ownership, like this is my classroom, this is our space. And it also means if we've come up with those terms of reference and rules together, it means there's less chance, I'm not saying it won't happen, but there's less chance that we kind of go against those rules or kind of sort of break those rules, because we came up with them together. They don't just seem arbitrary or I was just told to do that. We've sat and discussed it. And that process of creating those rules is of value in and of itself. So not just the end product of having our kind of movement terms of reference for our classroom, but that process of coming up with what can we do, what'll work, and looking at the pros and cons. So Dale, to your point, someone might say, for my movement break, I want to kind of jump off desks and dance around at the front of the class. It's then talking about that and saying, okay, sure, now what about this and how might that impact this person? So there's lots of kind of learning that can come out of that discussion and collaboration and compromise. And then, as I say, you've got a greater sense of kind of belonging and ownership of your learning space. Like, this is our room. And it might be my class next year, we have slightly different terms of reference for movement, because it's going to be different for them, what they've decided as a kind of dynamic that they're happy with.
It's interesting, Claire, you sort of mentioned that when you bring it in, it will be more disruptive at the beginning. And that made me think of the word novelty. Yeah. And actually, novelty is uncertainty in reality. Yeah. Something's different. I'm uncertain. Ooh. Yeah. Get into school in September. I'm in a new classroom. Oh, the novelty. I go back into my secondary school. They've got a new building. I'm in the science in the new block. What's it going to be like? What's the classroom? You spend that first few lessons looking around, and then you're used to it and it's boring and we're back to how it was. I think that novelty is purely uncertainty. And when you do bring it in, everyone's going, well, is he going to walk around? Well, how much is he going to walk around? Is he going to be walking all lesson, or is it just for 2 minutes? Oh, Dale just walks up for 2 minutes and then sits down again. Oh, I get it. And no one does anything. So that's great. That's the novelty, which is purely uncertainty.
And it fades. I mean, that's the thing. Uncertainty can't last forever, because we can't sustain that state, nor can we stay in a state of certainty forever. We're feeling very nice and certain where we are now, but if we were told we had to sit here for 12 hours, we would not be feeling very certain, and we would be in exactly the same place. And I do this piece of work with young people. We call it the circle of certainty. We draw a picture of them in the middle of the circle, and then they've got this circle around it. Now, the thing about the circle of certainty is that it shrinks. It doesn't stay where it is unless we are constantly knocking it out into the realm of uncertainty, which is the circle that goes around the whole thing. And unless we do little things that put us in a position of mild uncertainty on a regular basis, slowly, that circle shrinks and we end up in bed with the duvet over us 24 hours a day. Now, if we're just thinking back to COVID, that happened for a lot of people. That circle kept shrinking because they weren't being asked to get on a bus where people might look at them, or to manage a classroom where they had to deal with the sort of social environment. And perhaps they were in a position where they could turn their cameras off. Huge numbers turn their cameras off when they were having their online lessons. And this circle is always shrinking. So the good news in a way is that uncertainty can't last forever. Eventually people would get used to walking around at the back of the classroom. But the flip side of that is called certainty can't last forever. So everything is in this kind of dynamic flow all the time. And what we're looking for is ways to reduce the uncertainty and increase people's capacity to tolerate it. And I suppose all of this work is part of that.
And I think that's a really important point around that the uncertainty can never be removed. Because if there's one thing for certain in our world, it's filled with uncertainty. And so, as much as we might be looking at school and saying, look, we can put all this structure in place, we can make things really predictable, that final point of Claire's there, that what we're trying to do is to increase people's capacity to handle uncertainty. Because the only function of school is to prepare me for life after school. Life after school is filled with uncertainty. And actually, our brains in general, they don't want to experience no uncertainty. What our brains want to do is to keep us alive. And so they want to be really good at navigating the environment that we exist in. And the environment we exist in is inherently volatile. At that point about sensory, it could start raining, it could, there could be thunder, there could be lightning, all this kind of stuff. So actually, what my brain wants to be really good is handling uncertainty. Because if my brain just wanted no uncertainty at all, it would do as Claire said and just take us into a cupboard, shut the door, and just have us sit there all day and go, isn't this great? I'm really doing brilliant here, eliminating all uncertainty I could experience. So we do actually try to knock out that circle. And there is this kind of explore, exploit kind of equation that we're doing around that uncertainty. And one of the kind of really obvious ways in which we do this is play. So, if you look at a playground, particularly for younger kids, you'll see them all, if they're allowed, engaging in highly kind of uncertain activities. So lots of kind of what used to be called risky play, but it's been kind of rebranded adventurous play, because risky play is a hard sell, but adventurous play is an easier one to kind of convince people to do. And that's things like jumping off high heights, running at uncontrollable speeds, kind of play fighting, all these things. Even at a small, you can get kids spinning themselves around in a circle to get all dizzy and then wander around. And what they're doing is exposing themselves to uncertainty in service of future uncertainty reduction. Because in that moment, I am exploring the edges and horizons of my knowledge, and I'm increasing my sense of agency in this process. And so it's a really, really important thing for me to be able to do. And there's been a huge, huge erosion in play for children, young people, outside of school as well as inside of school, particularly that adventurous play. Because, you look down the list, I think it's sort of 7 or 8 things. Every single one of them would be things that, it's things like playing with axes and knives and fire, or playing near the edges of cliffs or big bodies of water, or games where you might disappear. It's a hard one for a head teacher to say to parents, we're going to encourage children at break time to play games where we might just not see them again. But those opportunities are being greatly reduced, and there is a kind of body of work that looks at the impact that has. Because back to sensory, the other thing that does is it helps me to get familiar with that feeling of being at risk, that feeling of being threatened, but in a safe way. So for me, at an agent level, I know I'm safe, but I'm putting myself in that situation where my body is still going to give me the cues that I'm experiencing something kind of threatening here. So I can become familiar with that sensation, but in a controlled way. In the same way, when you go to watch a horror movie at the cinema, I know me at a kind of agent level, I'm in a cinema, I'm okay. But I'm watching this axe murderer chase someone on the screen, and my body's going to respond as if I am under that threat. So my heart rate's going to increase. But it's in a safe environment that I can become familiar with those signals. So what that means is when I'm in a high stakes situation, when I get those signals again, it's one less uncertainty to navigate, because at least I know, okay, I know what my body's telling me right now. That's okay. I can now focus and address these other things. Otherwise, I've got the dual problem of this threat, this uncertainty that provoked this physiological sensation. And that's further compounded by I've got no idea also what this physiological sensation is. And now I'm in just a complete, I'm just drowning in uncertainty at that point. And that's when you'll see those, really extreme, exaggerated need to control behaviors and self-injury or withdrawal or whatever.
I think there's some research done after COVID where people who really were into roller coasters, get kind of roller coaster fanatics who travel all over the country going on roller coasters. And they were interviewed, I think, during or after. I keep talking about COVID, I'm really sorry, but it just pops into my head. I kind of want to forget it, but sometimes it was quite useful for looking at uncertainty, obviously. And they did some research on people who spend a lot of time on roller coasters, and they discovered that they actually, all horror films, one or the other, they had an easier time of managing the uncertainty of COVID. I'm not sure how they measured it, but there is this, actually, exactly as Jamie said, we've got a real responsibility to help people learn to manage uncertainty in those low stakes environments, and play being an absolutely fundamental one. And in secondary, just sort of, I think, we do a lot of trips out or taking people on out with bound courses or whatever, all this stuff that's been massively cut, but looking for opportunities of where can I help somebody experience uncertainty but in a completely safe environment. And I think it's a massive challenge.
And
Definitely.
it's
And I think I'm going to end it here. We've been talking for an hour.
no.
Somebody's done a couple of extra laps around the block while they've been listening. But I will end it with a really random, useless, but interesting fact that the probability of being killed by a cow is low, but it is never zero. If you work in a farm, it's going to be higher. You live near a farm, it's going to be higher. In the centre of London, it's low, but it's never, ever going to be zero. There's never going to be that certainty that you won't be killed by a cow.
There are we should use them as our mascot then, our symbol of uncertainty. The cows lurking around the corner.
Especially those, if you drink Carivendale, they want their milk back or something.
Thank you for that.
Really enjoyed it. It's one I always like it because I sit there and I don't always have to respond when there's two of you. So it gives me even more time to just ponder and think and relate, which I always really do enjoy. So thank you again. You've given me some links, and I've also got, so one's the Sense Like Cups and an anxiety workbook, and also your contact details as well. And as always, they're going to be in the show notes. Wherever you listen to the podcast, you'll find that information, or you'll find them on the Zencast website as well. So thanks for listening today. If you haven't subscribed already, click on that subscribe button wherever you listen to the podcast, and you can find out all the different places we're available on the Zencast website. And please follow us on various social medias. Just search for the Zencast and you'll find us. And if you listen to us through Apple Podcasts or iTunes, please leave a review and let others know what you think. And before we go, I would just like to remind you all to check out Zencast Sessions with over 100 great video CPD sessions. And if you haven't accessed a Zencast session before, these are video CPD sessions, often with the same great guests as on the podcast. And we release 20 sessions a year. 9 of these are live that you can join and ask to be part of the Q&A. And we also have 2 free send briefings. And the sessions are £10 each, and you get to watch live on the day, but you also get to watch them later on. They are yours forever. And it's a really great way to get CPD around SEND to all of your staff. And don't forget, for even better value, you can subscribe for £175 a year and access all of our CPD sessions. So thank you for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of the Zencast. It is goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from us.
Yes.
Bye, everyone.